Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final conference on inclusive mobility for an inclusive society, looking at new approaches and solutions and how transport can benefit us all. This is the final conference of the HiReach and INCLUSION projects, two sister projects funded by the European Commission under Horizon 2020, which have been addressing transport accessibility. They will be sharing their insights on what transport poverty actually means and how it is affecting the everyday life of many people. But the good news is that we will also be sharing solutions to make mobility more inclusive, and even will be looking at the business side of things and the viability also of different solutions from a business perspective. If we move on to the next slide. Thank you. So this final conference is also part of a series that we are organizing with the POLIS network, which is a partner in inclusion and is a European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable urban mobility and urban transport innovation. And what we want to do with this Mobilizing Mobility webinar series, of which this webinar today is part, is making sure that European transport innovation is also turned into local action, so that all the valuable insights that have been collected and have been written by projects such as HiReach and INCLUSION will not end up on a shelf, but will be integrated into local urban mobility policies. So we've had a couple of webinars already. Today, we have this webinar, which is focusing on inclusive mobility, and also the next webinar, which is taking place on Thursday this week, will be looking at 3 other projects that are also focusing on inclusive mobility and actually the co-design of solutions to empower vulnerable people and communities. So if inclusive mobility is close to your heart, we also invite you to attend the next webinar, which is taking place on Thursday. Without any further ado, let me share with you the housekeeping rules. So this webinar is being recorded so that we can also make it available afterwards. And there's also a live broadcast on the Inclusion Facebook page. We kindly ask all the speakers to keep their microphones muted when they're not speaking, but also to keep their cameras switched off when they're not speaking, so that we avoid any background noise and do not overload the connection. Then turning myself to the audience, you're welcome to also engage actively in this conference, and you can post your questions to the speakers in the Q&A box. We cannot give you the floor literally, let's say, but we will be processing your questions and I will be asking them to the respective speakers throughout the event. So don't hesitate to post the questions as you think of them in the Q&A box. Not in the chat, because it's easier if we can process them from the Q&A section. So without any further ado, I would like to move on to the actual program of today. And we will be kicking off this final conference with an overview of the 2 projects that we are talking about today. So the HiReach and the INCLUSION projects, providing you with an overview of what they have been doing in the different years that are now behind us, and now that the projects are coming to an end. I'll be giving the floor to the 2 project coordinators, Michele Masnata from AlgoWatt. He is the project coordinator of INCLUSION, and then also Simone Bosetti from TRT, the project coordinator of HiReach. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you all also from my side for joining this final conference. I hope you can see partially my screen. What is inclusion about? Okay, the objective of inclusion is to improve accessibility and inclusiveness of collective transport by targeting users who are vulnerable to exclusion in urban and rural areas, with a focus on rural areas. And in that respect, the project designed, implemented and validated innovative solutions that can be successfully and easily transferred. We'd like to present very quickly how this objective has been achieved in our project with an overview of our work plan. The project initially conducted an analysis of the main user needs related to the demographic, socioeconomic and behavioral segments of users potentially exposed to the lack of inclusive transport. This activity, led by the University of Aberdeen, identified and examined the challenges and gaps affecting equity and inclusivity by considering different area types and user segments. The outcomes can be considered indeed as the starting point for all the following activities. So this is the first pillar of the project. Starting from this analysis, the project then explored the possibilities and opportunities in terms of innovation. We investigated how a combination of information and communication technology and social innovation could offer new opportunities to fill the gaps that have been identified. And in parallel, a number of existing experiences were reviewed by conducting a total of 51 case studies. The findings from these case studies were synthesized and analyzed to identify repeating patterns, principles, and generalizable lessons. So all this made it possible to define a series of practical guidelines and also to refine, to a certain extent, the priorities and principle of inclusiveness for the categories of users already identified by the initial analysis. Another pillar of the project was the group of our experimental activities conducted in 6 pilot sites where a number of measures have been implemented, including the most promising innovations identified in terms of ICT and social innovation, take into account the guidelines from the case studies and, of course, focusing on the priorities and identified gaps. So the results of the demonstration of the pilot sites were then evaluated through structured evaluation activities with a validation process, with a process validation aimed at analyzing the so-called stories behind the figures. So how the piloting operations were conducted, the problems, the drivers, etc. And through an impact assessment that aimed to capture the results of the project through a number of KPIs to understand and measure the concrete impacts and benefits obtained at the demonstration, at the end of the demonstration. New business models were also defined for business scenarios identified in relation to the pilot actions and from the lessons learned from the case studies. This to identify new ways of making the proposed transport solutions financially viable, financially sustainable. The final conclusions then include recommendations on transferability of the proposed solutions and were formulated by combining the outcomes of the impact and process evaluation, the analysis of the business model, and other key project findings. And so I hope this gives a quick overview of our approach. Just a quick mention on the Inclusion Consortium, which has a good mix of skills and experiences. It is composed by 4 industrial partners with a strong background on transport and mobility, 1 research organization, the University of Aberdeen, 6 transport operators, mainly active in the operations of the pilot sites, and POLIS and EMTA as European networks and authorities to keep the link and connection with the stakeholders, which is very important to get effective and solid results and maximize the impacts. We also had a stakeholder forum and an advisory board with 17 members that ensure the constant support and consultancy throughout the project. That was a very quick overview, and we'll give you more information, more insights in the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Don't forget to unmute yourself, Simone.
Okay, here am I apologize. So thank you, Karen, thank you, Michele, and welcome to everybody and good afternoon. I will try to answer to the question, what is HiReach about, by showing you some key figures, just to give you a flavor of our project. First of all, one main goal, similarly to inclusion, the project aimed at exploring and developing new business models for collective passenger transport. And we tried to achieve this goal with a three-step approach. First of all, it was a matter of analyzing the problems about transport poverty. The second step was about exploring what is currently offered in terms of inclusive transport solutions. And the third and final step was about developing innovative and more inclusive transport solutions. 7 were the number of the vulnerable to exclusion user groups that we targeted specifically. As you can see here, there were the children, elderly people, women, people with reduced mobility, migrants, ethnic minorities, people living in rural and deprived areas, and low income and unemployed. As you can see, altogether, they make the most of the population, of the citizens, because they include everybody but an adult, white, rich man living in a city center of a big city. And we tried to involve those groups in 6 study regions in 6 different European countries, with a good mix of diversity in terms of culture, in terms of geographical scope, going into the urban or peri-urban or rural and remote environment, and in terms of user groups that we approached together with the local stakeholders and local communities in order to listen to them, to engage them, to understand their problems, their behavior, and together with them to validate the solutions that we have been analyzing and developing. 20 case studies and best practices that were under our radar during the exploration of currently existing inclusive mobility solutions. And we analyzed them in depth. We tried to understand their performances and their business models behind, and we tried to classify them in 3 main categories. The first one are solutions publicly contracted, so transport solutions that usually receive some sort of subsidies from the public authorities, or market-based solutions, so businesses that sell a mobility service for profit, and in between the community-based solutions, which are the ones where the users are also the producers of the services. And based on those lessons learned from what is existing, we started in developing new solutions. And to do that, and a key feature of HiReach was to engage 25 young entrepreneurs, startups, that worked with us within what we call the HiReach Startup Lab, which was an acceleration program to move from ideas to new solution in place. Indeed, in the end, we selected the 5 more promising startups and solutions that were further developed, fine-tuned, and tried in the field to answer to real challenges and real need in 5 selected European countries. And then the last figure is 8 partners. I mean, the team, we have been working together in the last 3 years to achieve these goals and to work on this topic. Besides TRT, the project coordinator, there were a good team of 7 other partners, including consultancies, SMEs, big institutions, 2 universities, and a company from the European startup ecosystem, and an association of users. And before I forget, I would like to thank all my colleagues, all of my partners for the hard work that we did. And I will leave the floor during this afternoon to them to let you know what were our achievements and what were the lessons learned from our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele and Simone, for this overview of the two projects. And now we will dive into the details also in the rest of this conference. But before we do that, we also have a keynote speaker, and we're very happy to welcome an authority in this field, Professor Rosário Macário from the University of Lisbon. And she will be talking about how we can move from problems to actual solutions and what the role of innovation in that respect also is. Rosário, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share the screen with you. And I start by giving an electronic good afternoon to everybody and to thank the two projects, HiReach and Inclusion, for this invitation. I think the topic is in fact a very important topic in our societies of today. And both HiReach and Inclusion are very valuable projects in terms of their outputs and their contribution to improve the current situation. I will be talking to you about first the mobility problems of the vulnerable groups, then the innovative solutions, and I want to bring up a new approach and a new way of looking into innovation, and then how to keep innovation rolling, which is most probably one of the most difficult things that in our societies, both from the side of the authorities and from the side of the agents, is the difficult part is to maintain the innovation over the table and maintain the enthusiasm over innovation. So let us then look and ask ourselves, is there anything wrong with the current situation? What is the problem that we have? And this is, in fact, if we look back, there seems to be an interest everywhere in addressing the factors of exclusion. So this is a recurrent discourse, a recurrent problem, but always in a very negative focus. And if we look at past decades, we have addressed mobility problems of exclusion, of disabled people, of minorities, and this has been our approach in the past decade. But in the future decades, everything points to that we must be bolder and that we must address access solutions. That is, we need to reach an inclusive society. We need to consider differently able people. And this is a totally different approach from the past. So we should not be looking at the specific solutions for, or the exclusive solutions for disabled people, but instead consider that our systems, they have to encompass conditions for differently able people. So basically, we should take an attitude of aim and manage, and that is the big turning point of the approach that we should have for the future. So we need to change the paradigm. That seems to be already a consensual issue. That is, accessibility is usually referred to as the ease of reaching goods, services, etc. So altogether, they are often recognized as opportunities for individual and society development. So if a person does not have accessibility to the main factors of production, consumption, etc., that person will not have opportunities for the individual development, and consequently the society will lose, because for each of us that does not have opportunities, is not able to create added value, the society loses. And this is a notion that we have to internalize. It's not only the individual loss, it is also the society lost. So mobility is in fact concerned with the performance of transport systems in their own right. And so we need to change the paradigm towards accessibility. And accessibility, in fact, brings the interaction of transport systems and land use patterns to a deeper layer of analysis. And in fact, social exclusion is the downside of accessibility. And this is something we have to understand. In the past, we have had a very unfortunate policy approach. And I read you an extract of a joint report on social exclusion from the European Commission from 2004. It is mine, the underline. And it says, social exclusion is a process whereby certain individuals are pushed to the edge of society and prevented from participating fully by virtue of their poverty, lack of basic competencies and lifelong learning opportunities, or as a result of discrimination. This distances them from job, income, and education opportunities, as well as social and community networks and activities. They have little access to power and decision-making bodies, and thus often feel powerless and unable to take control over the decisions that affect their day-to-day lives. In fact, this is absolutely true. It is a statement in 2004. We are in 2020, and we have not solved it. So we continue to suffer from the same problem, lack of engagement and lack of empowerment. So less able people are not sufficiently engaged, are not empowered. And because of this, they remain within the exclusion shadow. If we revisit the policy approach, then we should not talk about disabled people. Minorities are always answered with minor actions, and this is what we have to change. So we need to avoid this approach of little access to power, means also little relevancy. And so what we want is that differently able people do have the same relevancy than the remaining parts of the society. So who are these groups? Are the groups that have been taken care with in HiReach and in inclusion: elderly, children, financially impaired, intellectually impaired because of inflammation. It is a very relevant aspect. Physically impaired, visually impaired. So in fact, the exclusion does not result from one single factor. The exclusion results from a combination of circumstances. And so we have to widen our approach so that we don't focus in minor solutions to address minorities and keep them excluded, even if it is in excellence situation, but excluded. And it is the exclusion that we are fighting. So we need to rebalance the discussion. We need to rebalance the discussion and to stress that for the full participation in societies, we need to other conditions to be met rather than merely the access to transport. And the access to transport provides the physical accessibility to economic and social activities, but we need more than that to fight exclusions. So the key seems to be the development of cities and urban mobility systems, which is today our reality. It is more of a metropolitan scale, although of course the rural areas exist and continue to attract many people. But in fact, we need to recognize the urban dimension and we need to eliminate the combination of circumstances that in fact lead to or prevent people from fully participating in the society and so lead to exclusion. And this is the shift that we need to do, and a shift that must be reflected in our speech, in the political approach, in the research, in the tactical and planning aspects. And so all this change of mindset must be penetrate in all our process and all our levels of decisions. So inclusive accessibility must be defined, in fact, at the top level of governance and dealt with at the tactical and at the operational level. That is, we must go across all levels of decisions and have a clear and explicit definition of requirements for differently able people that must be included in the strategic decision. And this must be clearly settled with the objectives for quality of mobility, mode by mode, and for the system as a whole, but also on the engageable resources, physical and financially, because we are talking to a wider scope than in fact the stricto sensu transport and access to modes. So we need in fact to force a policy window opportunity to upgrade the issue in the political agenda, or to upgrade it to the political agenda, because in several countries it is not even in the political agenda. So, and this is in fact should be our target, should be our most important objective. Bring this to the political agenda, make it an important aspect. And then we are led to what are then the innovative solutions. And normally when we talk about innovative solutions, we tend to look at technological issues. And in my view, innovative solution is much more than that, the same way that our approach is much more than access to transport modes. We need to build bridges. ICT solutions are technology and are a very valuable instrument for inclusion. Because they allow and facilitate the engaging and the empowerment of users in the design of solutions, because they allow that users and citizens can play the role of human sensors and effective instruments for monitoring the system and for identifying the real needs. And also ICT gives room for new services to be formed by components of conventional services. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but very often we can use components of conventional services, flexibilize that, and they can act as feeders of conventional services, forming a very smooth chain of easing the access for less able citizens. And this is what we need to do, make it easy for less able citizens to understand, to get information, to have access, and to understand what is the use they can do of mobility and of accessibility for their own lives and for the opening of opportunities in their own lives. So we need to be more rigorous and more precise in the scanning of the needs. Mobility needs are not only about transport, they are wider. Less able people must have a priority, for example, in local of residences, the so-called accessible residences, but not only accessible on inside, but accessible in the location within the cities. Working places must allow proper integration of less able people, and social places should be inclusive, accessible, and connected. And this is a fundamental element. These are fundamental elements for less able people to be really included in our society. We don't want them to have excellent conditions of access, of physical access, but remain in an exclusion situation like driving special cars where only less able people are. No, we want them to be integrated in where the remaining parts of the society are. Mobility is in fact key to independent living. So empowerment is a fundamental concept in all this. Loss of independent mobility means not only to jeopardize the individual life, but also a negative impact on the society. So costs for care provision, loss of tax revenue, negative impacts on mental and physical well-being. So what is in fact innovation beyond technology? Well, innovation is changing your mind. Stop helping, change the attitude, give support, develop conditions, and empower, empower, empower. This is what we need to innovate. We need less able people to have conditions to be empowered, to live their lives with the same independency or close to the able people have. So innovation is much more than technology. And this is a very important message that we need to place in the political agenda. Why? Well, and how can we keep this rolling? How can we keep this over the table? Well, strategic guidelines and contracts should in fact recognize the added value of inclusive services and reward the operator for the innovative entrepreneurship and finding solutions for differently able people. We need to establish incentives instead of adopting rigid exclusive services that very often hamper innovation and economies of scale. And because of that, the operators typically run away from those solutions and avoid them as much as they can. So we need to stimulate innovative entrepreneurship and to create incentives sufficient for the operator to have an interest in creating situations of inclusion. So urban mobility systems must be operationally assessed and monitored as a whole, not only mode by mode and only in a few elements. The system must be assessed with client eyes. And that's why less able people should be part of the design, should be part of the concept, should be part of the creation of the accessibility chain. And this seems to be a very important and crucial element. The access chain is a key issue, and transport needs to be considered as an interlinked system with land use, each element of which, including information, the pedestrian environment, the transport interchanges, the user-friendly and accessibility solutions. Differently abled people have to be consulted in the design, in the delivery, and in the implementation, as well as in the monitoring and the development of policy, research, and legislation. They need to be part of the system. We are not doing the system for them. They should be included from the outset, included from the conception and from the design and implementation of the system. What does this mean in terms of policy approach? Well, the costs of providing a fully accessible system must be weighted in comparison and in relation to the costs of keeping people excluded. And normally this is not taken into account. Very rarely we see in a planning instrument, in a planning document of any city, the calculation or the estimation of what is the cost of living outside differently able people. We ignore this, and so which means that we don't have a proper accountancy of what are the costs and benefits. And we can have, the society can have a very strong benefit from including people and from having this innovative wider approach. So avoiding exclusive systems for less able people, this is in fact a poisoned gift, a driver for exclusion. And the past decades have proven this. We have invested a lot in technology, we have invested a lot in exclusive solutions, and we did not solve the problem of exclusion. And so we need to change our approach, and this seems to be a fundamental and critical aspect so that we can achieve exactly this. What we want is the well-being of the society, and the well-being of the society implies able and less able people, not having two societies, one of the able and the other one of the less able. And I hope this message can pass to some of you, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Rosário, for sharing your insights with us. We will now actually be turning to you, our audience, because we have some questions for you as well. I know some of you have been posting questions, and I see that most of them have been addressed already in writing, but we will come back later on to other questions that are still outstanding. But before we do that, let's launch a poll where we also have a clearer picture of who is actually our audience today and what your views are on the topic that we are talking about today. So first of all, if you could tell us a bit more about which representative or which sector you represent, which representative you are. Are you from a city, a region, a transport authority or operator? Are you a mobility expert? Are you from a university, a user association, or an NGO? So you can reply to this question now. I suggest to my colleague who can track the responses coming in that you move on to the next question when you see we have enough responses, Alexia. The second question, is there an inclusive mobility agenda or vision in your region? If you scroll down, you will see the second question appear. So it's a multiple choice question again. Yes, no, no, but there are plans in the pipeline, or I don't know. Moving on to the third question, further scrolling down, should transport be available for everyone regardless of the cost of its provision? Yes, for any trip, only for some kinds of trips, or no, providing transport for some people in some locations is simply too costly. And finally, the last question, can community initiatives for inclusive mobility suffice without support from the public sector and or commercial mobility stakeholders? Yes or no? So do we need support or don't we to make them survive, basically? So these are the 4 questions we are asking you, and we'll be coming back to the results of this poll later on. But before we do that, we will have some more presentations for you. And the next one is from Kristin Tovaas from Rupprecht Consult, and she's one of the inclusion partners. And Kristin has been leading the activities within the project on the case studies. So they collected and analyzed a large group of case studies, on the basis of which then the project developed the 8 principles and tools for a fairer transport system. Kristin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Karen. So, sharing my screen. Good. So, how can we make inclusive mobility a reality? That is the main question I'll be answering in my presentation. And how can we make sure that we leave no one behind? So, to answer these 2 questions, we first need to understand people's different mobility needs before we can respond to them with effective solutions. So I will start with this cartoon, which probably many of you have already seen in different iterations. So on the left, I think we can agree that giving everyone exactly the same thing doesn't benefit everyone equally. Not everyone can participate at an equal level. Whereas on the right, we see that different people have different needs, abilities, and resources. And if we use those resources wisely, then we can level the playing field so that everyone is included. So if we take this up as a transport metaphor, then we could see that on the left, we could imagine a standard transport system built for a typical working age commuter without any disabilities, language barriers, or anything of that sort. Whereas on the right, we see a transport system that responds to each user's needs. For example, affordable ticketing options could help support people with a low income or who are otherwise financially disadvantaged. Sufficient lighting and security to help make users feel safe and secure in navigating the transport system. And audio and tactile information if users have a sensory disability. So these are just some examples of solutions that could help different vulnerable users to use the transport system at an equal level. So the question is then, who is vulnerable to transport exclusion? Who are we talking about when we say that different people have different needs? And so in the inclusion project, we identified 12 user groups, which you see here, which are vulnerable to transport exclusion. And you see some of the usual groups that we might think of immediately or in the mainstream when it comes to accessibility and inclusivity. So that would be people who are physically disabled, sensory disabled, people with a low income, and elderly people. But we also cast an even wider net to include different user groups that have so far been widely flying under the radar or not recognized and addressed directly in transport solutions. So that includes students and youth, women, children, migrants, people with cognitive impairments, people in rural and remote areas, people without a driver's license, and people with a low income. So to better understand these users' needs, we analyzed 51 case studies on good practice inclusive mobility solutions. And these good practice cases were studied across the prioritized areas that we identified in inclusion, which are rural or remote, peri-urban, and deprived urban areas. So what we did was we analyzed the patterns and the success factors across these 51 cases. And based on this analysis, we developed 8 principles for a fairer transport system. And we can conceptualize these 8 principles as sort of keys to success when implementing inclusive mobility measures. So they're meant to help us to better understand vulnerable users' mobility challenges and needs, and to inspire effective solutions that respond to those needs. And you can see the 4 principles on the right: accessible, affordable, convenient, and efficient. They relate more to the traditional features of an accessible transport system, specifically to infrastructure, ticketing, and timetables, while the 4 on the left, empowering, empathetic, gender equitable, and safe, they focus more on the human dimension and the subjective experiences of people while using the transport system. So all 8 of these principles are equally important and can either inhibit or enable people in their mobility. So just to go through sort of the definitions of each of our 8 principles, first we'll start with the traditional features of an accessible transport system. Accessible transport systems are accessible physically, sensorially, and linguistically. And the linguistic aspect is something that we have added in inclusion specifically to target people who maybe don't speak the local language. So we could imagine solutions that involve either offering information in different languages or in symbols that are readily understandable also to children who maybe can't read yet, these sorts of things. And digital solutions also play a role here in facilitating that accessibility. In terms of affordability, that's a bit more straightforward. Of course, transport services should be affordable for all users relative to their income and proportional to their overall cost of living. And this also requires that an inclusive society will have to cover the related costs and subsidies. So this goes back to the equity concept that I was speaking about earlier. And convenience, this relates more to the time and or effort required for vulnerable users to reach a transport service. So this is first and last mile, so they can benefit from the service in their everyday lives. So this covers distance to the nearest service, reliability, and also information provision. And efficiency, this is again related to the time and or effort required for users to this time use the service. So when they're actually on the transport service, it relates to things such as longer journey times, changing vehicles multiple times. These sorts of things should be minimized to improve the efficiency. So this covers things such as the routes of the vehicles, the network coverage, and also intermodality. And now moving on to the human dimension and the subjective experiences of people while using the transport system, empowerment. So this is something that we heard about earlier. An empowering transport system or service helps to build vulnerable users' capacities to get around confidently. So this could involve providing adequate information and training, possibly also travel buddies. And here, especially technology has a role to play, a supporting role to play in empowering, not the key, but a supporting role to play. Empathetic solutions, sometimes when it's not possible to empower, empathetic solutions can play a very important role. So this involves fostering awareness and building capacities among the transport provider and also the general public for vulnerable users' needs, and to increase their readiness to help. Sometimes a helping hand can go a really long way. Gender equitable mobility services enable all users, regardless of gender identity or orientation, to have access to transport services that meet their daily needs. And this focuses specifically on facilitating intermodality, accessibility, and safety. And lastly, we have safe transport systems. So there's a bit of a cross-cutting theme here. Mobility services that increase the perceived or actual safety of all vulnerable users. And this distinction, or covering these two, the perceived and the actual safety, is a really important point to emphasize, because even if we believe that we're creating a transport system that is safe and everyone should feel safe, maybe not everybody does for different reasons. And so as long as certain users maybe don't feel safe in a certain space, there's inadequate lighting, there's not security around, or any other number of factors, it's too noisy, then they might not feel safe, and that would be a barrier also to using the transport service. So with these 8 principles in mind, we can qualitatively assess vulnerable users' needs and the types of solutions we should prioritize to respond to those needs. So here you can see that we have examples from 3 different user groups of the 12 that I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, the mobility barriers they face are very different. So for elderly, their biggest concern or the biggest gap tends to be accessibility and empowerment, whereas for rural users, convenience and efficiency is a major barrier, so maybe they need more flexible services. And for low-income people, they need obviously a more affordable solution, and also something that is efficient. But of course, many people fall into multiple categories at once. We don't conceptualize this as putting people into neat boxes, and certainly we can imagine that there are many people throughout Europe and beyond who would fall into all 3 of these categories. And so that's why when applying the 8 principles, we need to continuously try to understand and respond to users' unique sets of needs. And so I have some recommendations here for applying the 8 principles. And first of all, we need to recognize the compounded needs of different users. So as I mentioned, many users are associated with more than one of the 12 categories and are consequently even more affected. And without this sort of intersectional understanding of users' needs, we risk seeing users as a homogeneous group, creating policies and implementing measures that are assumed to benefit them all equally, but which mostly just work for some. We also need to give them a voice. A lot of these user groups are what we would maybe refer to as hard to reach groups. So they're often systematically overlooked or difficult to reach when we do have participatory processes. So solutions that are developed by vulnerable users, for vulnerable users, are nearly guaranteed to respond directly to their particular needs. And it also gives us a much richer and deeper understanding of what they need and how we can respond effectively. And we also need to build and maintain trust among these user groups. Because they've been overlooked and they've been excluded, the trust may be damaged or not there. So maintaining direct two-way communication with users throughout the process of developing inclusive mobility solutions can really go a long way and help us ensure that we do make big strides in addressing their needs. So to conclude, by keeping these 8 principles in mind, we can ensure that inclusive mobility projects work not only technically and financially, but also holistically address the target user's various needs and that they leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristin, for sharing the insights from the inclusion projects when it comes to principles and tools that we can apply to make our transport system more fair in the future. We have a question which is specifically addressed to you before we move on to the next presentation. Coming back to the topic of affordability, how can public transport authorities and public transport operators maintain the traditional payment methods for those who can only pay by those means, when at the same time the entire world is moving towards contactless payments as a whole, and even more, I would say, during the current health crisis? Do you have any views on that?
Okay, so this is, if I understand correctly, the question is going in the direction of not everybody has access to a credit card or a mobile phone. So how can we maintain ticket-based payment options? I mean, the infrastructure is already there, right? This isn't, it wouldn't be an additional investment necessarily to keep it there and to keep it running, but of course it requires personnel to solve these issues if they run into problems with the ticketed payment. I don't have a specific or very concrete recommendation for this, and it's not a specific question we addressed in inclusion, but it is something that we've acknowledged that technological solutions they're not a panacea, a silver bullet. They don't solve all of the challenges of certain users, and in fact can exclude some. So we do need to,
but
I completely agree.
Acknowledging the challenge or the problem is a first step in seeing how we need to address it indeed. Yeah, thank you. One more thing. So you've been looking at all these case studies at good practices, but did you also address bad practices? And did you learn from that maybe solutions that were looking good at first, but then didn't go as well as planned? And did you learn any lessons from such bad practices as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would call it bad practices because some of them were successful for a time, but then they just couldn't continue. And we did look at a number of these where funding was an issue and they just couldn't fund themselves in the long term. So one that comes to mind is the She Taxi, and that's in India. And it was an excellent solution. I really recommend reading more about this in our report. But the issue was they ran out of funding, and actually one of the factors was that they didn't have an app for people to reserve a ride. So it was a flexible taxi service run by women for women. Whereas there is an example, kind of an analogous solution in New York, which does have an app and it continues to run to this day. So that is one example. And we did learn a number of lessons. You can find more details in that report.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kristin. And we'll move on to the next presentation now, which is from Massimo Moralio. And it's a beautiful Italian name, but actually he's a senior researcher at the Technical University of Berlin and involved in the HiReach project. And he'll be talking about rethinking mobility poverty and better understanding user geographies, backgrounds, and aptitudes. Massimo, the floor is yours.
Many thanks for the sharing the video, everything. Can you hear me? I hope so. I hope also you can see my video properly.
Yes,
yeah,
we hear you. Perfect. And we see your slides.
Perfect. I'm very happy to be here today because after so many years working on this project, HiReach, I'm very keen to be today here to present this to more than 100 people. It's very, very interesting how much this is becoming a issue beyond the usual suspects. Because time is always very short, I will start presenting which is the overview for me today. The overview is, I would like to briefly introduce what we consider mobility poverty, where is more likely to suffer it? So as in the title, we have a geographical condition. Who is more likely to suffering it, because we have a social layers. And then the plea that we follow in the project, looking at the users. Usually the solution is better service. We try to change the topic and say, well, let's have a proper look at the users and how the users are usually framed. So what is mobility poverty? Well, traditionally mobility poverty is defined as the lack of service. So people cannot use a service, and this is traditionally targeting some areas, some social layers, or some people. And it's not always for everyone. Somebody else has very good service, actually. And someone has even personalized service. So before we start to understand mobility poverty, we have to understand this is something very uneven, very different for different people. So it's a first step. Looks banal, but you will see the consequences. Usually, the main answer to mobility poverty is more. So, as in the first slide, there is someone waiting a bus and the bus is not coming. Solution, we put more buses. We put more trams, we put more lines, more trains. This is actually a very good solution, can fix the problem. The other solution is less. You make cheaper tickets. This is actually starting to happen in many places where buses and public transport in general are totally free. Not just Luxembourg, all country now is free of use of public transport, but Dunkirk or other city in France, they are starting to do that. So this is becoming more mainstream actually in some area in Europe. Also because the revenue from tickets actually is just 10–20% of the final cost. So it's something that we should consider more carefully. Subsidies here are very important. We have a lot of subsidies and often are not used properly. So more or less a very good answer, but what we'd like to do is, as I say, looking at the spatial elements of this mobility poverty, the social layers, and then when we say looking at the users, looking at the ability to use a service. I can give you a very trivial example. When I'm a tourist, I'm going somewhere where I cannot read or understand the local language. I was in Japan. Well, this is becoming a very interesting problem for me, how to use public transport. And what is normal, what is exceptional for me in some areas very far away, or simply understanding the zoning of the ticket, the example. Well, this is often the case for many users because there are linguistic barriers, cultural barriers, understanding barriers. So we will try to unpack these concept of ability to use a service and try to understand how this service is made for the happy few, not for everyone. In other words, what we want to understand is which are the real user needs and the abilities and the social geographic specificities. Because if we don't go so much in depth, also theoretically, I claim that we need to be also a little bit more theoretical on that. And I agree with Rosário that we need a more political statement here. So we try again just simply to offer the traditional increasing or decreasing service or decreasing price, but we don't yet get the full picture. We simply put more buses and then you get these empty buses in countryside. You say, why they have an empty buses, 50 seats for this empty run? It looks counterproductive actually, because then the statement is that, okay, this is just a waste of money. So how much are we able to navigate transport systems? How much, this is an example of many tickets you can buy in I think it's Bern in Switzerland. It's a very complex system actually. We will see that in a second. What we have done a theoretical investigation, and already as Simone Bosetti indicated, we have also done 6 European Union field research, because at the end of the day, we can do a lot of desk work, but we should also understand better what the user thinks about that. So we're not just stating the needs of collaborating more with the users, but also we ask them what they think about this. So where is more likely to suffer? Usually in the city, the more and the less approach can be applied with some limits. Budget is one constraint, infrastructure limits, you can put more technology, apps to help. but at the end of the day, it's a matter of budget. You can put more trains and you can offer better services. Looks very easy, looks easy. This system fails totally when you go to low density area in the countryside. In the countryside, we try in the past century to replicate the city density model in more or less everywhere. There was the idea of this homogenized space, which is the nation or the region, and you replicate what is very successful in the city to the rural area. It doesn't work. We have wonderful examples where this works, like Switzerland, but these are actually exceptions. And then I would like to stress how much this is a problem also for the peri-urban or suburban areas. These are usually, we talk always about the city and rural areas, but peri-urban areas are not only in Europe, a huge part of the population of Europe. And often you have very, very big pockets of transport poverty, mobility poverty in this area. These are a little bit a forgotten child of the discussion. Here we would like to stress that this area not only have problems, but we will see also can have also some solution when you start to use the users also as prosumers. They are also offering a service. Who is likely to suffer this mobility poverty? Well, this is the traditional list. There is the risk of labeling people. There is the risk of labeling groups. There is the risk of making a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or you are low income and therefore you have mobility poverty. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy. So then you feel trapped in this labeling. But for sure, we can say that for these people, it's easier to be impacted by this mobility poverty. Again, we should go a little bit beyond and try to understand why these people are often eaten and other people are not. And then I use the case of James Bond. James Bond is the archetypal figure for not just running very sporty cars, but also when the public transport manager think about the public transport, they think of a man, adult, white, perfectly fit, perfectly able to read maybe 5, 6, 7 languages, able to jump, able to do everything. So starting from James Bond is a very good moment to understand that actually we have other sort of users, which are not, we can define them as more vulnerable compared to James Bond. But if we have the mindset that the user is that sort of person, then comes very easy to say, oh, they are a little bit an exception. And this is pretty much the case with disabled people. We made a lot of stuff for disabled people and we fix all the problems because you have James Bond and then the wheelchair. And this is the traditional use of the traditional answer of the public transport managers. Not everyone, I found very clever people, but usually this is and because it's very difficult actually to understand their needs and practice, you need to start to make a tailored service. And this is clashing with the idea of a transit system. The transit system is for masses. You don't start to make a salami demographic of each user. You start to say, okay, this is for everyone, and then you have to learn how to use that. And this is clashing even more if you're in rural area or peri-urban area. So as you see, these problems are piling up, and then ask for a change of system, where maybe running a bus as a passenger is not as complex as a nuclear plant in Soviet Union in the 70s. This is the picture of that. But surely, if you think more carefully, using a public transport or just simply riding a car, it's not a complex system. To ride a car, we need a special permission, which is a driving license. But even to buy a ticket for a bus, it's not easy. I remember working in Sydney for quite half an hour before I finally found the place where to buy a ticket. But in our research in Romania, we found the same problem, that buying a ticket in our case study there, it's very complex. So, and then you have to choose which ticket you need, and then so on. So let's try to dismantle this system and try to understand this is a problem for some users. So James Bond usually not only knows where to go, how to go, but he also avoids people shooting him, jumps on train. Well, this is of course fictional, but this is the idea we have behind that. Mobility is for this sort of people, and we are not James Bond, and actually I'm not keen to be an imperialistic secret agent. I think that we should look at the users in a different approach. We should convince policymakers and change also the discussion that we shouldn't work for James Bond. James Bond can fix his problem on his own. We should look at other people, those who are not so sure where to go and how to go. And this will be the change from the system, which is a uniform system for masses, give it to everyone, looking to a more tailored system where it's more fitting the agenda of different layers. Second point, mobility is not just A from B. You can have crazy people building these crazy bicycles because mobility is an identity space. So we should consider that mobility is like food. We need to eat, but preparing a nice food or having a nice ride is not just eating. It's a place where we express identity, the same for clothing, the same for... So we have to think that when the moment we offer public transport, we offer a transport at all, we offer a movement, we are also impacting some identity moment. And this is an identity space. And if you offer a very cheap, bad service, can be unsafe, but also on the more deep level, identity, well, this can be rejected. And people at the end of the day stay home, and this is creating and confirming this spiral effect of moving less and the more being more excluded. Even using an escalator looks very banal, but I can tell you that it's not so easy. It needs a lot of practice, and there are a lot of indication. As I said, an escalator is already not easy for everyone. Can you imagine using a bus or maybe in another country or in another area that you don't know, or you are confused, you are not reading so well, you have other impairments. So let's take this very seriously. And the moment we put more technology here, especially telecommunication here, this can be a great opportunity. And I don't underestimate all the people not using. I think they are using too, but can be also a big problem. In terms of how much this is impacting the ability to use different services. So if we want to find solutions, and I think that with HiReach in the second part of the project, we look at for this sort of solution which were customer friendly, easy to use, and as much as possible tailor it. And we have done that also often in considering users and service provider as the same person. One day you can offer a ride, and the next day you can be offered a ride. So you don't need to invent the wheel. To some extent, we can crowdsourcing this ability to be very tailored, user-friendly, and as much as possible, easy to use. The spatial situation, the geographical situation is also another big issue, because the rural or the semi-urban, it's the big problem. In the urban area, we can have additional other issues like safety may become more a case, but also rural area, I wouldn't estimate that. We have different approach by users. In the rural area, people want to know who is traveling with me. There is a sort of trust that you have to build day by day. Urban area are more anonymized. But this is something we have to consider more carefully. All this debate, we have reassumed that in a book, this first part of the project, including the case studies, a book that will be soon published by Routledge in December. And the bonus is that we made an effort to have this open access, because we believe that this can be a big boost also for the debate and for the discussion. It's coming soon. You have the link here, but I will put them in the chat. And here my 15 minutes over, and I'm very grateful all of you, because it was really thrilling to make the presentation, not just from HiReach, but also inclusion, engaging POLIS, and having, as I say, so many people today. It's really encouraging that we are doing something in the right way. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Massimo. That's the alarm that you've reached your
yes.
15 minutes indeed. Thank you for sticking to the time. allocated. I have a quick question for you before we go to the results of the poll. There is a question asking whether real-time passenger information would have anything to do with the more or less comparison. Rather than adding too many buses, could we alleviate commuter concerns through the use of real-time passenger information?
Yes, I think that this is a good way to make more without putting more buses. The question remains that we have also to change habits, because we don't have just mobility poverty, we have also climate change. So we have to change the habits we have, that the bus is coming when I want. We should forbid James Bond to drive his cars because they are too polluting. But in the other way, we should also think that we have to change habits and considering mobility as a luxury. Because, or at least to have a more equal distribution of mobility. Because at the moment it's totally unequal in the way that some people, including me, pre-COVID, I'm using a lot more mobility than other people, and this is totally unfair. So yes, can be a good moment to change about this real-time communication. Excellent, I like it, but we have also to start a cultural discussion that mobility is a luxury. And then we don't have to expect the taxi be there, the car be there, and the bus be there.
Okay, thank you for your response. So let me ask my colleague Alexia to put up the results of the poll that we launched earlier to see who you are and what you think, basically. So who are you? We see that the majority of you are coming from the academia, so a lot of very wise people in the virtual room, and also many people who call themselves mobility experts. If we take those two groups together, we have indeed a very smart audience, but also happy to see that if we take the city, region, and transport authority and operators group together, that they together also represent some 20%, which is of course an important target group as well of this project. So let us move on to the second question that we asked, whether there is an inclusive mobility agenda or vision in your region. And I'm happy to see that at least yes has received the biggest answer, so share of answers, 40%, but also still 17% says there is nothing. At least there is 10% that says something is in the pipeline, while quite a large group is actually not aware of what is going on. But let's take it from the positive side and focus on the 40% and the 10% that is in the pipeline. Now, on the question whether transport should be available for everyone regardless of the cost of the provision of the service, 60% says that it should be available for any trip regardless of the cost, while 29% says it should only focus on certain trip types, and 12% thinks that in some cases it is simply too costly and cannot be provided. And then coming to the final question, whether community initiatives can survive without support, a large majority of 79% says that this unfortunately is not the case. And that's why it's also important that those two projects that we are looking at today have been looking at business models as well. And we'll be coming back to that after the coffee break. But before we move on to the coffee break, let me quickly turn to the two coordinators of our respective projects. So back to Michele and Simone to see if they are surprised by the answers from our audience, or whether this is in line with their own views or what their expectations were when we launched the poll. Maybe first, Michele, any views?
Yes, thank you, Karen. Yeah, I would say I'm not surprised, certainly, for question number 3, when we think of inclusive transport as a social right, the answer is yes, it should be available for any trip. And so it's important really to have, as has been said in this conference, a holistic approach that could allow a bottom-up approach in the design of inclusive transport, not only top-up approach. So really, this could allow to enlarge the possibilities. And also for community initiatives, we have one of our pilot sites in the Flanders region, where community-based service exists, a peer-to-peer transport service operated by volunteer drivers. And it is an excellent service that complements the existing public transport service. But when it comes to introduce innovation and add features to that service, then we have seen that some problem can arise. So this is an example of the importance of the support for the public sector. So not only financially, but also in terms of organization.
Thank you, Michele. Any views quickly from your side, Simone, before we let people have their coffees?
Yeah, well, not a lot to add to what Michele already commented. Maybe just a remark on the last question, the last answers. I mean, the role, the need of public subsidies, which is, I mean, there is something in between, because you can use subsidies to pay for something different from what is currently provided. I mean, because there are different way, more inclusive way, flexible transport that would fit better the user needs. And so it's a matter of allocate in a proper and wise way the public money to support different business models. But I really believe that we will come back to this later after the coffee break.
Yes, indeed, that is still on the agenda. Thank you for your quick reaction. So that means that now we are at the coffee break. We would have loved, as these two projects are being coordinated by Italians, we would have loved to offer you a delicious espresso, but given the current circumstances, and as we are online, you'll have to go and get your own coffee, I'm afraid. But we will reconvene at 3:30, and then we will continue with the rest of the program. So see you in 15 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed a nice coffee or tea break or whatever you were drinking. Let's resume our final conference program now for the Inclusion and HiReach projects. And in this second part of the conference, we will be looking at the solutions, and we'll be looking also at the business solutions beyond those transport solutions. We will start the next set of presentations with a presentation by Vivian Chiusi from Intrasoft International, and she's Senior Business Innovation Manager, as well as Caitlin Cottrell from the University of Aberdeen. So they respectively represent the HiReach and Inclusion projects. So they'll be talking about how did we get to establishing the solutions that were identified and developed within the respective projects. Ladies, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Bear with me one sec. So my name is Vancluysen, and I will take you to the journey of how HiReach partnership established the solutions. How did we get there? So all was a matter of asking the right questions. The goal of HiReach was to develop new business-oriented mobility products capable of improving accessibility in urban and rural areas and adapted to the needs of vulnerable citizens. To do this, the partnership had to answer several questions and overcome challenges. So we went by a Socratic method of asking the right questions to fetch the means to get the right answers. Do we have the solutions that fit them better? Do we have the consumer? How do we ensure a participatory process? What is the correct recipe for success? And how, of course, we ensure user acceptance, which is the question of all. The final goal was to explore and develop new business models for collective passenger transport. Let me take you now briefly to how the journey started. Everything had to happen via participatory approach, meaning we wanted to engage the several lists of classification audiences we have seen we need on board of stakeholders. So we needed entrepreneurs that are capable of designing solutions for these people and give them proposals according to the real needs. We decided to work and study areas we prioritized due to their morphology, geography, economic development, even affected by seasonality issues that could be easily replicated with other areas in Europe. We involved local communities, policy makers, and experts. So we conducted a list of interviews and approximately 18 focus groups and workshops. Everything happened by the use of calibrated personas. But why is that? Personas are very helpful, especially in agile projects. They're fictional persons representing a key specific user, reflecting a group. The personas are models of a user community, helping a team to predict how users will act. So we utilize the personas that you see on the left-hand side to create user stories to help our solutions development. We did also quite a lot of exploration of what is available in Europe. There were 20 hand-picked innovative transport solutions that we have selected, and we assessed them according to 4 dimensions: their ICT interoperability, how they were sharing economy principles and for the groups that they were meant to, their attractiveness, of course, and the new and organizational and business models they were represented. We complemented our research with interviews with key players. We did a sort of generation of ideas that we shared with the larger audiences because we always wanted to validate at each step all the type of ideas that we put down in paper. So we went also to several events and multidisciplinary workshops. To do a more concrete answering on the questions we have done on the study areas, we did a second roll of focus groups where we have shown the hand-picked solutions to our participant stakeholders, and they came back with their reply for these solutions that they were more applicable to them. And we ended up with certain recommendations that helped this journey to go on. So we had shortlisted services from the study areas, and then the project provided open software tools and APIs, but also created an insights package, because that way we wanted to motivate the startups. We also kickstarted the HiReach Start Lab. That was a very big activity. I will explain later on why. It lasted for quite long. And in between, we worked for transferability of the proposed and tested solutions. Talking about the startup lab, that we also hear more details from my colleagues, it was quite lengthy since it lasted for some months and it concluded this September. So we started with a bootcamp in February with 23 startups participating in brainstorming about business model innovation, different methodologies and tools, product validation, and market potentials. Actually, this was a very interesting activity that gave us more strength to continue. So the idea, the participation, the different discussions gave us concrete insights also for the deliverables. Some of them are public and we will show them at the end of the discussions. And you can also visit the website. Then we moved on the startup acceleration that lasted for approximately 3 months, where we had 10 startups. We discussed there and worked on technical solutions, business models, an open toolbox API that was compiled by HiReach. Towards the end of this long activity, we had the piloting and testing, where we had selected 5 startup solutions. There were several meetings and networking between entrepreneurs and decision makers. What we got as a feedback also from the participants throughout this lengthy activity is that it was very interesting to them to see what others are doing. They felt that they had a sort of international recognition by this participation, and they also wanted to do the testbed their ideas under real life conditions, and they were given a chance. But also they wanted to be part of the HiReach community, which actually is growing. All in all, before I give the floor to the next speaker, all this process proved to be quite successful because we had very integrated participants from the stakeholder side. We ensured that we heard all the different stakeholders, and we had done a lengthy research that we validated in different steps. Of course, now it's time for assessment of what happened before HiReach and what comes after HiReach. And this we want to transfer, and you will hear at the end of this particular webinar from our colleague at the end of the webinar. I give the floor to Caitlin now to show the methodology of the project inclusion.
Thanks, Vivian. Okay. So just to give a quick recap on the user vulnerabilities, Kristin gave a really good overview of the kind of the background research and the information that went into this development. But one of the things that we saw when looking at the different user groups that we were considering is that, as Kristin indicated, there's no one size fits all. And that's largely because there's no one way that people experience exclusion and vulnerability from mobility. So one of the things that we tried to do at the start was really to identify the different ways in which people might be vulnerable to exclusion. So the way that we categorize this is vulnerable to exclusion from mobility services because of impairments or communication barriers, vulnerable to exclusion from accessing services and activities because of limited or limited safe transport options. And then finally, those who are vulnerable to exclusion because of the affordability of transport options. You know, and this is a fairly broad brush, and I think that we all know that there are many other ways, but this provided a fairly useful way in which we could begin thinking about moving into solutions. So if we could go to the next slide. So as Kristin discussed, we started by developing this large set of case studies. And in addition to looking at the different aspects of mobility that we needed to consider, we also tried to look at a wide variety of geographic areas as well as transport contexts. I think several people have indicated that it's really critical to think about the differences of a rural area, an urban area, or a peri-urban area, and the way that we address mobility. We also looked at different population groups and, of course, different mobility solutions with particular attention to projects addressing the needs of the vulnerable groups that Kristin indicated and that I indicated in the earlier slide. What that helped us do was develop a corpus of evidence of concrete experiences from various both European and non-European sites and pilot initiatives, in particular those that involved both public and private providers, as well as a variety of regulatory and business frameworks in addition to looking at the different supporting technologies and organizational and operational conditions. So what we didn't want to do was look at a particular case and think, oh, that's great for anything that's public transport. It was really beginning to think, how do we, consider the fact that you may have an area where you've got public and private transport providers, you may be looking at technological solutions, you may be looking at other types. So it was really trying to give us a really good way to be able to understand both what was needed from the user side. So on a demand side, what do the vulnerable users need, but also on the supply side. So what are the mobility gaps that we might be hoping to address? Drawing from that understanding and the case studies, we went into the development of the pilot labs. And those are the real life measures and interventions that have been done through the project. So we've had real life demos of 13 measures in 6 different countries, which will be talked more about later, but each of which was really trying to pay attention to the needs that are identified for these different groups. So what is the type of area that you're trying to serve? Who is the vulnerable user population that you're particularly targeting, or which of multiple vulnerable user groups you're trying to target? And in terms of how, which actors are involved? So is it a public organization? Is it a private group? Is it a community organization? And how can the type of solution that's being piloted be delivered in a cost-effective way? So we utilize the case study investigation and the innovation experiments, and we took the information from that, and the information that was generated has been enhanced and validated through external collaboration with our stakeholders forum. And that was set up at the onset of project activities. And it comprises a large number of groups, including transport operators, local authorities, user associations, and advocacy groups from different EU member states. So we were trying to evaluate what was working well, what are the results, what is the input that we're getting from these different users, and then that's used to develop the business models for the best solutions. And what that does is it brings together the key information for transferable delivery, and I know it will be discussed later. If we can go to the next slide. So one of the things that we find really nice about the inclusion in HiReach projects, and a way in which they're quite complementary, is that HiReach has taken a more market-led approach, which fosters solutions initiated by private sector providers and entrepreneurs, whereas inclusion, while again we recognize private sector opportunities and the need to incorporate private sector players, has generally explored solutions with more interventionist approach, involving stronger rules for the public sector. So in that way, you're getting a really nice complementarity between the two projects. Thanks.
Thank you, Vivian and Caitlin. And as Caitlin was just highlighting, the HiReach project has invested a lot in engaging with mobility entrepreneurs. And that's actually what the next presentation will be looking at. André Marquet, our next speaker from Productized, was leading the Startup Lab Acceleration program within the HiReach project. So he'll be talking about that in his presentation. André, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. So, I think I might just share my presentation, right? Or you want to do it from your computer? Let me know.
Please go ahead. You can share your screen, yes.
Okay. So I'll be sharing my screen with you guys. And if you confirm that you can see it, that'll be awesome.
We can see it.
You can? Okay, great. So, I'll be talking about how we have engaged the mobility entrepreneurs and the startup community in the HiReach Startup Lab Acceleration Program. My name is André, and I'm from Productized. So I'll be covering HiReach very high-level goals and how we engage the mobility entrepreneurs, but also the HiReach Lab startup, the HiReach Startup Lab, the entrepreneurs themselves, the startups, and some conclusions. So the HiReach goals were developing innovative mobility solutions to improve accessibility for areas and communities in need. And those new mobility services, they would encompass a wide range of services and solutions, including mobile ride hailing, car sharing, scooter sharing, mobility as a service, and so on. So has Massimo already shown with his James Bond picture, lots of these services, they have historically been designed for middle-aged, independent men living in urban areas with fairly a high level of digital literacy. You know, the guy with the suit and the tie. And the question was, where are the mobility services for the bigger part of humanity? And can we find solutions that suit more diverse social groups? People with low income, women, migrant, children, and so on, also already referred on Karen's presentation. And the big question we had in the beginning was, would we be able to engage the mobility startup ecosystem in this endeavor? Because HiReach aims the creation of viable business models for scalable mobility services that can be provided at affordable prices or with minimum subsidies targeting low density and transport poor segments. And historically speaking, entrepreneurs, they tend to go for where the money is, bigger markets, and this at the beginning didn't seem to be a very interesting prospect. So we developed this three-phase or three-steps analysis, which was divided in step one being the analysis of the mobility needs, step two, exploring mobility options, and finally step three, developing the new mobility solutions. And for that, of course, we needed entrepreneurs that were capable of designing those solutions for these target segments and give them the proposals according to their real needs. And that's why we developed the HiReach Startup Lab, which is an acceleration program that was aiming entrepreneurs that wanted to have positive social impact, but also having a profit mindset. And that would encompass startups that were either pre-seed or seed stage, meaning that would have, you know, something has a product or a service that was still in prototype stage and not fully complete product or service. For that, the HiReach Startup Lab provided a pool of mentors, also the networking within the HiReach consortium, the network, and also connection to pilots. Those pilots were a full matchmaking service that was conducted by HiReach consortium members that found suitable pilots in private companies and also public contractors like municipalities, regions, etc., in several European Union countries, and match those with the most relevant startups according to their own projects. So that was one of the aspects. The other aspect that I think was really critical was the development of what we call an open toolbox that compiled a number of free and open source providers of APIs. And this was conducted by the University Polytechnic of Bucharest. And basically, we allowed the development, the fast-paced development of routing algorithms, optimization on the apps and web apps of some of the startups, including, in this case, the screenshot is CityMass that's used the geospatial and routing algorithms from some of these APIs on the product that they developed for people with mobility needs. The actual acceleration phase was operated by Impact Hub Vienna in Austria, and the program itself had three stages. The first stage was a startup bootcamp, which was a one-week bootcamp where we covered business model innovation generation, product validation, market potential, and this was really critical because we had 25 startups going through this bootcamp, and by the end of this one-week bootcamp, we reduced that. We did the first cut to only 10 startups, and those were the 10 startups that did the follow-up 3 months acceleration program. Keep in mind that this stage of the program was done during the COVID first wave, so it was really hard to manage the startups and to make sure that they were being properly addressed. And finally, we had the piloting and testing that happened during the summer of 2020, and the demos of the 5 finalist startups happened last week on September 15th. And in this last stage, they had the chance to develop and test bed their projects and prototypes under real life conditions with the pilot companies. So let me just jump directly to some of the entrepreneurs behind the scenes that were really the driving force behind the startups. So these are the faces of the startups and the startup founders and some of the CEOs as well. The ones that are flagged with finalists were the ones that went to the last stage of the program, but all of these 10 startups, they did mostly of most of the acceleration phase. So B2Ride was and is a workplace carpooling service. Childify is a children community transportation app. CityMass is a mobility as a service platform for reduced mobility people. Dreamwaves is a sound-based navigation app for blind people. Hoop is a carpooling service for everyday rides, for hospitals, for daily commutes. Lamilu is a last mile delivery of pharmaceutical products already working and operating in some German cities. And keep in mind that they started from zero in the bootcamp, and by the end of the acceleration phase, they were already cash flow positive and delivering pharmaceutical products. Mobito is a mobility data platform based in Brussels. NEMI, a demand responsive transport service for low density areas. Neo Mobility in Romania is a low cost urban multi-point rapid delivery system, and Tandem is turning local taxis into shared microbuses. So the 5 startups that our HiReach Startup Lab jury selected to go to the phase 3 were Childify, that worked with an association in the south of Spain working with children and children transportation to school called La Noria. CityMass, that worked with a private bus operator in the north of Portugal called Valpibus. Dreamwaves, that developed their sound-based navigation app for blind people with Austria's leading association for blind people. Hoop, carpooling for everyday rides, that developed their COVID-19 use case with a leading hospital in the El Escorial region close to Madrid, and that allowed for staff members to commute to the hospital in a more convenient way. And EMI, a demand responsive transportation system for low density areas, that worked in the region of Puglia in the south of Italy and developed their pilot there. So some conclusions was this. This was actually a diverse pool of problems and groups covered by the finalist startups, from blind people, reduced, impaired people, children, rural, older people, low income. So I think we were able to have a wide spectrum of needs and segments covered by the startups. So we didn't feel that there was any vacant point or a group that was not being properly addressed with startup innovation. I think it's important to stress that startups have shown great resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. Even in the regions that were hit the hardest, they were able to pivot towards new opportunities like medical transportation, pharma delivery, that were actually very, very helpful for people during those times, and they still are. Startups and founders were also very fast to answer to cash with no strings attached incentives, but also to effective mentoring and to the pilot matchmaking. And this was really an important opportunity that allowed them to have new revenue streams and new business partnerships provided in this case by the HiReach program. And most startups we have to remind that most startups will outlive the scope of the HiReach project. So they will be with us for the next few years. They will continue to serve their business and communities and hopefully keep growing. And that's, of course, what we want them to. Not all of them will be with us in the next few years. So that's why I think it's important to keep monitoring to understand the real EU social economic impact. Thank you.
Thank you, André, for this overview of the different startups and entrepreneurs that you worked with and that you selected. A quick question, which is actually to both projects, as we saw that HiReach was particularly looking at the private sector on the one hand, and inclusion focused more on the public sector. Have there been any efforts, or will there be in the future, to match maybe supply and demand? So to match the solutions from HiReach with the needs, for example, from the public sector representatives in inclusion?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that from HiReach side. Maybe Simone or Massimo will be able to provide a clear perspective on that.
Any of the other partners who would like to come in and say something about this?
Hi, it's Steve here from Aberdeen University. I think we'll address that a little bit later on. But yes, it wasn't so much that the inclusion project was looking at public sector solutions. It was where the public sector had a more prominent role in the delivery of the solutions, engaging with private community sector organizations. And I think it's that partnership type solutions that we found to be the most effective. And that will, in the presentations later on, become more apparent.
Okay.
Yes. And I expect the same thing from the other side of the coin for HiReach, although it was focusing on trying to develop entrepreneurial solutions through the startups. Obviously, for sustaining those and for ensuring that they're actually addressing the specific needs of vulnerable users, there is a requirement for additional ongoing funding at some level, and that really has to come from the public sector as well. So I think there's a point in the middle where both projects meet, and that's where the level of involvement and funding that's necessary from the public sector perhaps is taking a different route to get there, but we probably end up at similar conclusions.
Okay, thank you. Keep posting. Sorry, Cosimo?
Yeah, just a quick answer from the HiReach side. Yes, definitely when we're working with the startups, some of the products are not only addressed to consumers, but also to the needs of public authorities. So for them, it was relevant to try to understand also the needs from a public authority perspective in order to have products for them. We deal with some of them also with the data management and data provision, and they were forced also to think out how to integrate their solution into, let's say, a more wider perspective and in public policies especially. So definitely true.
Okay, thank you. We'll have more time, I hope, later on for further questions and answers. So keep posting them in the Q&A box and I'll come back to them later. But first, we'll move on now to the next presentation, because it's all nice to have innovative solutions, to have inclusive mobility solutions, but we also need innovative business models, as has been mentioned before. And that's what our next speaker will be talking about. Vasco Reis from TISH in Portugal, a representative also of the HiReach project. The floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon to all. Thank you very much for your time. And let me just share my screen. Just a moment. Yes. Okay, I hope you are seeing the front page. Good afternoon to all. My name is Vasco Reis. I'm a senior consultant at TISH. I'm also a senior researcher at the University of Lisbon. And I am here today precisely to show you how we develop or how we move further from the startups to the development of innovative business models for inclusive mobility solutions. So let me just recap again HiReach's main goal, that was to explore and develop new business models for collective passenger transport. And so the focus was precisely on the development of these new business models. This had several impacts and purposes. So foremost, the focus here was the development of market-driven services and products. So essentially user-centric. Secondly, we also wanted that these business models to be successful for the entrepreneurs and for the region, meaning that the companies or the organizations that will implement these business models will have a very good income and will be, from the business perspective, successful, meaning a reduction of public subsidies and reduction for the burden over the public budget. And finally, there is also the need and the call at the EU level for promoting entrepreneurship and innovation, particularly in the domain of transport poverty and in this specific niche, which so far has been neglected. So the focus was on the business model. Here, there are many definitions. We borrow this one from Osterwalder. This is a relatively well-known business model definition. And it says, so business model describes the rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value in the economic, social, cultural, and other contexts. So we have here these aspects. On the one hand, we have the need to create the value to the customer, because it is a customer that will buy the specific service or product. If there is no value, there will be no customers, and the company goes out of the market. And then it is value for a specific context. In this case, we are talking about alleviating, mitigating, tackling the problematic of transport poverty. So let me start with the customers. Several of my previous colleagues, both from HiReach and from Inclusion, they have already presented the vulnerable social groups that we used here and considered here in the project, 7 segments. It is important to mention that these customers, they are the end users, but when you're talking about the business in the logic of a B2C segment, so business to consumer segment. But here I like to highlight that, as you will see in a moment, we also have business models that are in different segments: B2B, business to business; B2G, business to government; or even B2B2C, business to consumers. And so the customers of these business models can be, for instance, for-profit companies, like, for instance, retail companies, pharmaceutical companies, transport companies; not for-profit companies, foundations, religious organizations, etc., NGOs, or even public institutions. So in the market of transport poverty, there are a lot of consumers. We have indeed the vulnerable groups, but we also have organizations and other kind of institutions that can be consumers. Let me also talk about the dimension, the second dimension that is related, within which the business models were developed, that is the transport poverty. As my colleague Massimo has already discussed, the transport poverty is a relatively complex concept where we have different layers and different dimensions of poverty. Essentially, we have 3 main factors. We have spatial factors, we have the social layers, and also we have the inner characteristics of the person that all combined will lead to the transport, to the emergency of transport cases, transport poverty cases. Why I'm talking about this? Because in the development of the business models, we had to take into consideration not only the customers, but also these very specific properties and characteristics of the transport poverty problematic. So, how have we done it? My previous, the previous speaker, so André Marquet, has precisely presented how we have not spent time on this. Just to tell you that the HiReach Startup Lab took 6 months, from February to September. We began with 25 startups, 23, something like that. But the point is, then we shortlisted in 10 and then finally in 5. We used the 10 business models as inspirational cases for the development of the innovative business models that I will present you right here. So essentially what we have developed is a design was 7 prototypes of business models. Why prototypes? So as you can see on the right, a prototype is like a blueprint. It is agnostic to the market, and the idea contains all the elements to help an entrepreneur, an organization, a company, but to help someone implement the business models in a given market. So essentially, here is that you can use the prototype to implement the business model in different regions across Europe. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go all over them, but very briefly, as I said, we had 7, so we identified 7 prototypes, or we proposed 7 prototypes. A journey planner in which the interface with the user, either on a smartphone, tablet, or computer, can be adjusted in terms of looking and feeling to the specific needs of the user. We have a system that helps people moving about in the city and also in the public transport, just using the sound, specific carpooling solutions for children, for people living in rural areas and other segments. The blue one here is working more, is this model more for the B2B segment, in which the idea here is to help companies, helping customers and employees to come out of transport poverty situations. The green one is a business model that harvests data, so relevant data for the vulnerable segments, in order to bring it to help public organizations like municipalities to develop better mobility services. Delivery of goods is also very important one. It is one of a kind, because many of the people that suffer from transport poverty, they are stuck or they have difficulties going out, and more even to bring their own food and other stuff. And then finally, we have a solution to help people living in sparsely populated areas, low-income people. Let me just give you a couple of examples that were inspired into specific startups that Andre Marquet presented in the previous presentation. So the first one is the Journey Planner. So it is really a highly flexible and customizable user interface, and provides a very intuitive user experience. It can be delivered as a white label, so it is transparent and invisible to the user, but essentially it adapts and reorganizes what you see in the screen of your mobile phone or your computer to your own needs, in terms of size of the font type, the color scheme, the location of the buttons, even the contents can be totally adaptable to different people. So an elderly person will see different information and the screen in different way that the young people. Can even, for instance, be adaptable to foreign people that not speak the native language of that specific region, so on and so forth. So from the value proposition, it able to reduce the digital exclusion, and it helps a lot people to fulfilling their own mobility needs without depending on others. Let me just show you here 60 seconds of the promotional video that was already developed within the scope of HiReach project. Well, then...
Paško, if I could ask you to wrap up because you have used your 10 minutes, so...
Of course, I will wrap up.
Okay, thank you.
Just to conclude, to say that the business models, they cover a wide range of, and they target all the customers of the vulnerable groups. What is really relevant here is that they also target the non-vulnerable groups. And why this is relevant? Because since we want to looking for very inclusive business models, we are looking to the entire population, the vulnerable groups, but also the non-vulnerable groups. Secondly, this will also increase the viability, the commercial and the business viability of what we are proposing here. The customer target is much larger. Finally, just to tell you that we are just finalizing the transferability and the scalability analysis that will help anyone to implement the business models in their own locations or in other locations across Europe. So I really invite you to come to the website, and of course, if you have any doubt, please let me know. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Now we're moving back to the inclusion project, actually, and we'll be looking at the pilot labs that were involved in the project and which lessons we learned from those respective pilot sites. So I'm handing over now to Andrea Lorenzini from MEMEX, and they were coordinating the pilot sites within inclusion. Andrea?
Thank you, Karen. I'm just sharing my screen now. Is now working?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I will try to start the time. I've got 10 minutes to present you the outcome of our inclusion pilot lab. I'm Andrea Lorenzini from MEMEX, and we have been coordinating the pilot lab throughout the inclusion project. So first of all, a step back, why we developed it and what pilot lab do we develop in our project. As you can see from these maps, we have 6 pilot labs developed in different countries in UK, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Hungary, and Germany for 3 main reasons. The first is to test. So more than 20 different solutions have been implemented and developed in addressing different vulnerable user needs. Secondly, for learning about this experience, and we developed a qualitative and quantitative process evaluation where we really gain into deep about the lesson learned about this. But thirdly, also to convince, to make a sort of exercise to talk with stakeholders, to key mobility stakeholders, to understand the concept of inclusive mobility and how they could act for do that. And for whom these are the targets that we've been addressing with more specialized, that we can see there are different on the left target users that we have addressed, older person and people with reduced mobility in Flanders, families with young children, disabled, blind, visually impaired people in Budapest. And on the right, we can see also a number of measures or solutions that we try to do for developing a more inclusive transport system. So here I am just to present you the summary or what we call quick wins. And for do that, I'll try to use this perspective of the 8 inclusion principles that were presented a little while ago by Kristin, for seeing how we have tried to tailor that into solution on the ground. So if we talk about empowering or empathetic or gender equitable transport system, we thought that understanding or developing an in-depth analysis of the main user needs is an important or fundamental aspect. Because for that, you can develop solutions to answer mobility needs, increasing ridership, and especially user satisfaction towards the transport system. And we developed a very in-depth analysis in all of the pilot lab. Here, I just put here some example of that with a co-participatory process developed in Campi Bisenzio in Florence, or the focus group developed by Taxi Stop in Flanders, or the crowdsourcing platform and training of the staff of the public operator of the staff in Budapest by BKK. And for that, the key aspect was also to have a support from organization that represented the target group is crucial, because they were the link for us that enabled to really get in touch with people, put the operator or the authorities in touch with the communities, understand really what are their needs. Secondly, the technology was one of the key aspects that the inclusion tried to address. And here I put again 2 examples from Barcelona and Flanders pilot lab. From Barcelona, there will be also a presentation later on by Lida that explained you more in detail that, but through a social network data analysis, the operator was able to identify location where in less densely populated areas where there was no public transport available to go to social or festival event, it was possible to deliver commercially viable services. So new routes were established and new users had the possibility to attend these kind of events. As well for the MobiTwin app, that was a digital version of the last mobile service in Flanders, that was a community-based transport service, as mentioned by Michele before. There was a development of a digital app to match in real time the demand with the offer. But here on the other side, we noticed some background or some problems, because clearly when talking about technology, you need to understand who are you targeting. And clearly with elderly people, you can enter some challenges because, for example, we learned that with community-based transport services, the social aspect, the social interaction between people is essential. And for example, you have to develop co-creation activities so that the elderly can be guided through that. Another aspect that we wanted to raise concerning affordable, convenient, or efficient transport services is that with quick or smart solution for reducing the time, the budget, or the effort that the vulnerable user required to access transport services. This can lead to a lot of benefits, especially for improved job opportunities and increased participation in social life, for example. And here again, I tried to put 3 examples from our pilot lab. For example, again, in Florence, there was a redesign of an important bus line for people with migrant background, so that reducing the interchange time between the bus and the tram, there was an increase in passenger numbers, and clearly people could access the town center easily. And as well for Rainsig Pilot Lab, there was an increase in service frequency in key hours, so from 4 to 7 p.m. And there was as well a bus fare that was reduced by 20%. And that gives more independent travel of children and of people, and also the increasing satisfaction with general mobility offer. And finally, one just to raise also the Olympus Mobility app. It was a sort of mobility as a service application where there were different services that were made available to the job seeker in Flanders. And there was also a provision of a personal mobility budget of around 30 euros. But again, for that, it was a good success, but it was maybe just a piece of the puzzle, because clearly to find a job is not just a mobility problem, it's more a broader problem. So again, for that, what was needed was what was emerging is that there was the need of a broader project or broader collaboration between different stakeholders, so that these kind of people could be guided through access transport service to make job interview and things like that. And finally, last but not least, is this kind of public-private partnership that was mentioned by Steve. And here I put 2 key examples in those that we can call poorly served areas or poorly served user, and where e-bike sharing services was piloted, especially in Keighley National Park, in the Scotland, and the Rainsig pilot. And again, here we highlighted 2 major rules of the private sector and the public sector, because with this collaboration where, for example, the public financed the services, the e-bikes, for example, in Keighley, and the local bike shop were used for maintenance, operating costs, and so forth. This was a good combination that led to a very good outcome of the pilot. And as well, I have a sort of ambassador in the local communities, like bike shop, that act as that could really be a success factor. And as well, in Rainsig Pilot Lab, there was quite a different approach, because there was an improved user information through developing a new map with a clear explanation of the bike paths and so forth. And as well, also there was a collaboration, because using the local tourist office to host the service of this bike hiring measure was clearly a good aspect. So these are the 4 quick wins that I wanted to produce, and just to conclude my presentation, where to go next. First of all, I invite you to have a look at our project website, because there are a lot of resources that you can look for. For example, if you are interested in a particular pilot, there has been a specific deliverable that has been delivered for each of them, where you can find everything about stakeholders involved, lesson learned, measure implemented, transferability issues, and so forth. But we also developed an in-depth evaluation activities about process evaluation and impact evaluation. And again, in these deliverables that you can see at the bottom of the slide, you can have a broader look at what were the major outcome of that. But as a final slide, I would like just to stress this point, and I wanted to put here three important sentences that were about key stakeholders that we try to involve in our project. So I don't know if the current transport system is for all, because there are problems about transport poverty, justice, inequality, and so forth. So what was clearly emerged by 2 years of inclusion project activities was this definition of prioritized areas that, from my perspective, is very important to highlight. So what are the areas that the policy sector or the public sector should be focused in? And we came out with this definition where we define transport environment with gaps in infrastructure or service provision that impact upon transport accessibility and inclusivity, and where there are the biggest challenges in serving target user groups, vulnerable user groups especially, and their mobility needs and requirements. So probably it's time to act for that. It's time to change a little bit our mindset, or the mindset of the authorities and policy, just to really join forces together to further improve the level of inclusivity, equity, accessibility of our transport system. And that was my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for this overview. And now we will single out 2 of the pilots and look at them from a business model perspective. More precisely, we'll have a look at Barcelona in Spain and Cairngorms in Scotland. And Lydia Sala from Mosaic Factor will tell us a bit more about those 2 pilots and how the business models have been addressed.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I will try to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So as Karen said, this session will try to zoom in on the previous presentation made by Andrea, and it will be focused on 2 experiences of the 2 inclusion pilot labs, Barcelona and Cairngorms, trying to explain the flow from a pilot demonstration to a potential inclusive business model. So I will start with the Barcelona experience, and I will go through each of these 4 steps, explaining the problem, which was the solution, the challenges and opportunities, and some of the key transferability lessons. Which was the problem for the Barcelona case? The target of this pilot were occasional group of travelers, as Andrea said, particularly young people that were moving as individuals or as small groups to common destination, and in this case was a music festival. These prioritized areas were areas where there was limited public transportation, and that was because this public transportation was inflexible or infrequent during nighttime, and also in this case the public transportation was operated on a radial structure linking the peripheries with the Barcelona city, but leaving some peri-urban areas and rural areas not well connected with the location of the event. So the majority of the BusUp users, BusUp was the on-demand service provider, were young people and concretely women. Women as being seen a user group that shows lower rates of car ownership and also that have more vulnerabilities using public transportation in odd hours. As a number, 85% of the first-time BusUp users were or are women. So the solution we were proposing here was about to reducing territorial accessibility barriers to attend to these events located in the peri-urban areas of the Barcelona metropolitan region due to poor or inflexible transport offers. And in here, 2 key measures were implemented. The first one was about identifying potential users' demand that wanted to attend to sociocultural events through mainly social networks analysis. And the second one was about identifying potential geographical areas to propose the most suitable bus stops locations for the uncovered demand. We had different actors involved. we had Mosaic Factor, the ICT service provider. In here, we developed the forecasting model, trying to identify the geographical areas with potential demand to attend to the event, and propose the most suitable bus stops locations for this uncovered demand. And then we had Bus Up, as I said, this was the on-demand transport service provider, and they were aiming to increase transport accessibility in different prioritized areas with a safer, cheaper, and more comfortable ways to travel. Then we also had other external actors involved, such as the event organizer, Canet Rock, and also different local buses operators. This solution applies information mining from social networks, complemented by other data sources such as demographic distribution, transport connectivity, historical data of past attendees, political results, high school locations, and as conclusion, this analysis enables planners to aggregate mobility demand, potentially, in this case, even attendees, from different geographical areas, which are poorly served. These are poorly served mainly by existing public transport. And the aim was to propose these suitable bus stop locations and routes for the unserved demands. And here, what I want to do is to highlight some of the challenges and opportunities of the different actors involved in this pilot. In the case of the on-demand service operators, one of the challenges is that demand is sometimes hard to detect, and only a few of the commercially viable solutions have the vulnerable users in mind. But an opportunity in this case is that this vulnerable demand that is hard to detect requires information mining, and potentially social networks can be one of the key sources to explore, depending on the targets we have in mind. For the technology providers, one of the challenges was to understand the mobility problems and trends in order to have bigger impacts in the model development. On another example, for the user cases, in here, one of the key challenges was how to switch from traditional transportation modes to others that were more innovative and sustainable. But for the users as well, in this case, the solution was to have more affordable and reliable transport option. In this case, also it was safer and more accessible, offered by the on-demand service provider. Some of the key recommendations for the long-term sustainability of this pilot, we found that it was very needed to have promotional activities to make the target segments aware of the service. Because if you try to find this potential demand, but they don't know that the service, on-demand service exists, it will be difficult for them to buy the tickets. Another key recommendation could be that the process of identifying these pockets of demand in the low demand areas could be the winning card for the development of dedicated and flexible and also accessible transport services. So this business model, you will find it also in the deliverable that I will mention later, and I don't have time to go through all of the building blocks that we analyzed, but this business model can be transferred to different events of youngster or other targets, but also to other segments of users. So we have also analyzed the key transferability of such business model. The second experience I will go through is the Cairngorms experience. The Cairngorms National Park is one of the most popular tourism destinations in the Scottish Highlands. It is the most remote region in Scotland, and it is the largest national park in the UK. And we have identified in this area different public transportation challenges. One of them is that it has low density and dispersed population that results in dispersed, or that this results in dispersed public transportation coverage. And they have infrequent services and very long journeys. It is a very aging and resident population, and there is a large number of tourists in the area. In here, we identified different vulnerable users. One of them were the elderly and people with reduced mobility, local residents and youngsters that doesn't have access to their own mobility solutions, and finally, inhabitants in dispersed settlements. The goal of this pilot was to improve the accessibility to public transportations for both residents and tourists to and within the protected rural landscape of the Cairns National Park. And in here, 3 different measures were implemented. The first one was about integrating e-bikes hubs and schemes with public transportation. And the aim here was to promote the modal shift and to create safer, active travel environments for both residents and visitors. The second measure was to integrate the lift sharing scheme and car clubs with public transportation by promoting and encouraging the use by young adults and allowing them being part of the wider mass scheme. And the third one was about delivering an improvement of multimodal travel information services using real-time data. In this pilot lab, a key partner involved was HiTrans, and it was the regional transport partnership of the area. Some of the key challenges and opportunities that we highlighted, I would try to say some of them. For example, in the public authorities, one of the key challenges could be how to choose correctly which type of assets to be purchased that meets the needs of the users of each area. But an opportunity for them could be also that these measures will help to fill the mobility gaps that are left by limited public transport services in rural and also peri-urban areas. And in the case of the users, it will also imply a change of behavior, requiring to adapt their habits to new these new mobility schemes. Some of the recommendations for the long-term sustainability of these partners, one of the ones that I will cite is that responsibilities allocated to public and private organizations needs to be specified in details to avoid gaps and to facilitate the interaction between the two sides. Another one would be that the special allocation on creating awareness of the existing service is very important, and this can be done through communication and advisors, but also with some training courses in case of, for example, e-bikes. And this will be my final slide. As I said, we encourage you all to take a look into these 2 dedicated deliverables that we developed in inclusion. Both of them are in line of the inclusive business models, and we have defined 12 different business models dealing with different user needs, business concepts, and scenarios. And we have further assessed them and provide recommendations for the 7 business models you have here in the screen. Recommendations on the transferability of this business model in different schemes. So that's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Lydia. There are 2 questions specifically addressed to you, but I suggest we take them after our next and final presentation, which will again be a joint presentation from Cosimo and Steve, so both from the HiReach and the Inclusion projects, and they will be summarizing the key messages that we need to take away from these 2 projects and the main lessons learned. So the floor is yours, gentlemen.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, I will share my screen. Sorry, that's yeah, I have to find out the right. Sorry, I was not. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, let's go. So yeah, we are at the end of this day, and let's start with the lesson learned from HiReach. My name is Cosimo Chiffi, and we as TRT were the coordinators of the projects. So first, as Massimo Aurelio said, from the very beginning, we tried to shift the conceptualization of transport poverty and also the understanding of let's say, the subject of our work, and to extending also the concept of and our work to the mobility poverty concept. This was really important because we had the chance to enlarge the scope to offer also the possibility at the end of a project to give also to policymakers and scientists also the a new understanding of this issue and on the challenges of mobility poverty. Here, as you can see, there are some pillars that we have further analyzed and that you can find a lot. We will find a lot of details also in the book that will be published in just a couple of months. It will be an open access, so you will have also the possibility of looking at these results. And as you can see, there are several underlying conditions, like exactly also the possibility to look at the attitudes or the fact that multiple social disadvantages might happen in the same way, or that there are also both social and spatial differences and challenges. And this was pivotal because we understood that, of course, a combination of these elements should reinforce also phenomena of social exclusion. So for us, let's say this was the first lesson learned and result of our work. Another area where I think we work pretty well and we found a lot of power and potential in the way that we approached the project was in having such a huge fieldwork activities and focus also on the micro-analysis of the needs, but also on the attitudes of the people of our vulnerable user groups, working also in such a different geographical areas. And just after the first part of the project where we focused on desk research, we moved immediately to the fieldwork. And there were some iteration, a way of interviewing people, stakeholders, then to focus on the vulnerable groups, talk with them, try to make use cases of the scrutinized solution that we found at the very beginning, trying to understand also the potential of this solution to be transferred. And then again, also with the new business models, with the startups, we created also a way of feeding also the acceleration program with the personas, for example, that were also very useful for the entrepreneurs. So let's say it was also fundamental in the aspects of designing the solutions, and this was another very relevant lesson learned for us. Third, it's pretty true that sometimes there's a lack of funding, or a market maybe is not as big as for allowing a new product to be viable. But we found out a lot of services that are still rigid, not inclusive, not optimized, and not only the services, not only the solution, but most of the time it's a matter of relying on frameworks that are not inclusive. And of course, it prevents also the possibility for some of the case studies, for some of the solutions that we developed, to be scaled up in other contexts. And also the fact that maybe it's true that we need to save money, we need to use public money in an effective way, but there are a lot of silos that where also resources are there and should be integrated. We also understood that there's a growing demand from Europe, and the dichotomy urban-rural is maybe not existing anymore in a way that we observed in the past. We received a lot of requests from other regions of Europe asking, for example, for hosting a pilot or deliberating, showing us their own challenges in trying to find out suitable solutions for vulnerable user groups or for certain territories. So it was really interesting, and it gives us also the possibility to understand that the potential is very, very high. the fourth lesson learned is about the role of innovative businesses and the communities that for us acted as prosumers, so producers of mobility services as such. And they can play a role, they can play a role, and it was very beneficial also to combine this with a startup acceleration program. We put the destiny of our project in the hands of startups and in the hands of local communities. Having already analyzed a number of solutions, that was a way of keeping a degree of freedom in the result, in the final result. And it was really, really interesting. And we understood that, of course, there's a need of providing them support from the public authorities, from the investors, because there are a lot of phases in which you need to support such groups, from the design of a new service, but also in the testing of the service or a solution. And startups were really engaged in the acceleration program, and from what they provided us as a feedback, that was really different, because we provided a lot of knowledge, and they were able to focus on the real needs instead of simply concentrating on IT components, technology, etc. So it was really interesting for us, and we explored a number of solutions, from, let's say, the on-demand public transport to having carpooling systems that are more inclusive, but also to focus on the integration of data for public transport authorities, or from a user perspective, the possibility to navigate in the mobility system. Yes, now we have Steve. If you can switch on your...
Thank you. Thanks, Cosimo. Yeah, if you just move to the next slide quickly, then we'll try and catch up some time. So I'm Steve Wright from the University of Aberdeen, and we led the evaluation work package in the inclusion project. And these lessons learned have been derived from that evaluation work of the pilot lab demonstration measures, but also taking account of the best practices from the case study reviews that were undertaken. The first lesson, and this relates to the planning and the design phase, is that the most successful solutions were those where extensive demand analysis and user requirements work was undertaken. I mean, this is fairly obvious stuff, but properly understanding the needs, the wishes, the capabilities of the target users, it avoids you developing and delivering solutions that are not compatible with the user's way of life or pace of life. And the form that these kind of user requirements and demand analysis work may take can vary according to the complexity of the user's needs. So the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see moving from the right to left, increasing complexity in user needs. So for users who may be otherwise able, but they're vulnerable to exclusion from a specific activity or a location due to lack of transport service, which was the case in the Barcelona pilot lab, then digital data analysis may be sufficient to establish the unmet demands for people and the locations where people don't have a transport service to that particular activity. For users where they might not have particularly complex needs themselves as individuals, but their transport needs may be multifaceted, then surveys can be a suitable approach to establish the needs. But for those users that have the more complex needs, then one-to-one interviews and co-design workshops are really required to be able to fully understand the issues that are faced when traveling and the types of solutions that those groups need. So it's therefore essential to provide platforms or settings where those vulnerable users' voices can be heard and can be responded to. And of course, co-design provides this platform, but it also has to include all the other stakeholders involved in delivering the solution, as well as the end users. But co-design sessions, they take time, they add costs to the development, but it is so essential that it's necessary, I feel, and the inclusion project has concluded that public sector funding, and much more public sector funding, needs to go into this phase of understanding what it is that users, vulnerable users, need and what types of solutions are most appropriate for them. So that's the first lesson, really. Next slide, Cosimo, thanks. I think it's taking time to catch up, but the second lesson really is that in terms of getting as much uptake of solutions that are delivered, again, for certain users with the most complex needs, we need one-to-one support when we're delivering the solution. And of course, building partnerships within communities is a key requirement in achieving this. So local businesses and community organizations are really essential here. They can act as that sort of partner on the ground, the local champions who can direct the other organizations in the community to refer suitable vulnerable users to use those mobility solutions. An example was in the Cairngorm National Park, where the e-bike sharing scheme was being hosted by the local bike shops, but they formed partnerships both with local businesses, but also with health providers. And the health providers could refer patients recovering from hip replacements to use the e-bike service. Local businesses could refer young employees who had no other means of accessing the work location. So establishing those partnerships is a really powerful way of making sure that the target vulnerable users for the service are actually then engaged with the service and can benefit from them. And again, on the right-hand side, the figure just shows that different types of interventions are different depending on the capabilities of the users. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, the third key lesson is that ICT solutions can play an important role if the needs and skills of the vulnerable users are fully comprehended. And this goes back to understanding at the planning and design stage what those needs are. So of course, if you're introducing any technology, it has to be co-designed with the users, ensuring that specific needs are accommodated in the solution, but also this builds early familiarity and trust in the technology from the users. Too often technologies are developed without specific vulnerable user needs in mind, and then delivered in expecting that users will just adopt them. Well, you know, it just doesn't happen like that. And those users that have the more complex needs, they need ongoing support in adopting and using technologies. So it's not to say that ICT isn't actually beneficial in some situations, but you have to design it carefully and you have to deliver it by either providing pre-trip training in terms of using the technologies to the user groups, or assistance while actually traveling, so that those vulnerable users can build up a confidence and a trust in using the technology all the time, you know, with support from trained members of the community or professionals. But we have to also remember that for many vulnerable user groups, social isolation is a key issue. And the human element of delivering mobility solutions is especially important for those groups. And so while technology can act as an aid, it shouldn't be seen as a replacement with that human touch for many groups. Okay, next slide, Cosimo, thanks. And finally, for me, in terms of lessons learned, the public sector does have a really key role to play through just both the financing, but also monitoring, assuring quality, and also ensuring safety. So public-private partnerships or public-community partnerships can often provide the best means of delivering cost-effective services. So this can be where the public sector funding is used to initiate a new service, which can then be operated at a lower cost by the private or not-for-profit organizations. And through this type of partnership funding, the public sector has the leverage to ensure that vulnerable user needs are properly catered for in the solutions that are delivered. And that means that those vulnerable users will actually benefit from the schemes. They can also ensure that safety and security of users themselves, but also their personal data is enforced. It's important also that these partnerships can involve private and community organizations by adding value, by increasing the promotion and engagement within the local community, because these are the organizations that actually are based in the communities where services will be delivered to users. And so, of course, that's a really essential and key aspect of ensuring we have uptake of the solutions by the targeted vulnerable groups. Okay, I'll hand back to Cosimo at this stage and he can summarize the key messages from the HiReach project. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so key messages, or at least what we refer to be the key recommendation that we target to policymakers, authorities, but also entrepreneurs and the society, the local communities. Starting with the first group, the policymakers and the public authorities, it's true that you need to have a very transparent and clear vision, inclusive mobility vision, and that also that the power and the scope of mobility organizing authorities should be extended to embrace also other services, other type of urban mobility challenges, especially from vulnerable user groups. And authorities should adopt a bottom-up approach and perspective in investigating also the motility, so the attitudes, the possibility for the people to move, and also enlarge and integrate different inclusive mobility options. This is something that is already happening. There's a way of providing also more data to the company, so having also a transparent role in this is pivotal. And sometimes also a matter of combining different funding streams that are there, as I said, and remove normative barriers and design an integrated social pricing systems in a way that vulnerable groups may have also incentives or possibility to access services that are offered by the market. Of course, public authorities should and policymakers should support and provide their support to social innovation, also by simply linking the work of the startups and innovative entrepreneurs with the local communities and with the operators. If we will have to give some messages to the entrepreneurs and to the investor, what we found out is that they should not consider transport poverty as a market niche, so something product that is strictly focused on one sole specific needs of one sole or maybe a couple of vulnerable user groups. It's a way of designing a solution or a service that fits for all. And it was really something that was referred in what they learned from the acceleration process. So it really mattered because the market is quite big. Of course, they will need to look at additional funding streams and revenue streams, including the ones coming from the public sector. And they should adopt country managers because we understood that there are differences also in cultural elements, in territorial elements. So, of course, if you will need to scale up your service in other countries, you will need to understand that market or those markets also. Of course, they will need to start competing with other providers, mobility providers for innovative, inclusive mobility services, maybe trying to enlarge also the offers or more traditional ones, and develop solutions that are modular, so they are likely to be upscaled, and also trying to address different vulnerabilities at once. And of course, they will need to focus in those areas and in those markets where there's already a strong and public agenda for inclusive transport. As far as users and communities is concerned, they would, of course, they will need to define their problems and needs. So it's also a matter of analyzing also and complete these multi-facet diagnosis of the mobility needs of an area and in relation also to the local framework conditions. Work with policymakers in suggesting ways of optimizing also the usage of available resources instead of reclaiming simply additional funds. So it's a matter should be more proactive. They will need to find the right balance in public-community partnerships. It's not only a matter of giving them the responsibility to provide the mobility services themselves, but it's also a way of find the right balance in it. And collaborate with other organizations, try to link with the innovative entrepreneurs, with startups, and also try out the new solutions. And there's a change of behavior. This is something that is also happening, and there's also a growing interest from the investor in having these type of experiences. So these are the key messages that we address to this last group of stakeholders and actors. Please, Steve, go ahead.
Okay, next slide, thanks. So this just summarizes really what was stated before, but the key messages are that firstly, user engagement is essential to understand the needs of the users, and this must be done at the planning and design stage. And there's examples there in the bullets of what was done within the inclusion project to achieve this. So co-participation design workshops in Florence and elsewhere, crowdsourcing apps which were delivered in Budapest, providing a platform to share issues that users experience while traveling, or the data mining of social network Twitter data in actual fact, to gain knowledge of the unmet demands to the Canet Rock Festival in Barcelona. And the second thing is that there needs to be a stronger recognition of the cross-sector societal benefits, and from that, establishing cross-sectoral partnerships for a more efficient service planning and delivery. And this would result in better and more coordinated funding between public sector departments within health, social services, education, employment, and transport. And of course, once this is in place, we'll end up with much more integrated service provision, which is really what we want. It's integrated in terms of who can use it, but also integrated in terms of the cost of delivering it. So another outcome from that can be establishing shared vehicle assets for the benefit of all sectors and users. The third thing is that the use of public-private partnerships can provide a very effective and cost-efficient means of delivering tailored solutions to vulnerable users. So this is particularly effective where the user demand isn't sufficient for fully commercial services, but it also provides this mechanism to ensure that where private providers are offering a service, they are adequately providing for the complex needs of vulnerable users. It also enables technology solutions to be tailored specifically to vulnerable users' needs as well. And the fourth lesson really is that, or message, is that the community involvement, community organizations can help to expand the range of service provision at low cost. And this can be used to fill gaps in the existing public transport network through things like volunteer ride sharing or demand responsive community buses, either driven by volunteers or paid drivers. And vehicle brokerage is also a key service that is offered through community organizations. And the final thing is that the community involvement is also necessary for promoting the uptake of these new services and technologies and to assist users in actually making use of them. And again, within the project, there was staff and volunteer training, which informed staff on how to deal better with vulnerable users when they came across them using services, how to recognize them, and how to assist them in a way which retains their dignity. But also the provision of one-on-one assistance while traveling can be done through community organizations as long as those volunteers are trained properly. So I think that's the key messages that we've concluded from inclusion. I think we've got one final slide, Cosimo. Yeah, so this is back to this sort of differences between the approach taken from HiReach and that taken from inclusion. I mean, common to both is that user involvement and engagement is absolutely essential at the planning and design phase. It's also essential at the delivery stage, but if you haven't done it initially at the planning stage, then what you're delivering isn't suitable for purpose. And to actually realize the user involvement requires good partnerships. And this can be either with private sector organizations or with community organizations. But often the very best solutions can involve all three: public, private, community partnerships. And although HiReach and inclusion, or the conceptualization of the solutions, came from different directions, I think in the end, both projects resulted in the need for these partnership type solutions. And I think that's really the final comment from me. So I'll hand back to Cosimo or to Karen for the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen and Cosimo. I think this conclusion, the need for joining forces for public-private partnerships in developing common solutions and in deploying common solutions, is a nice message to end this final conference of both the HiReach and inclusion projects. We've already passed 5 o'clock. In the meantime, I would like to thank all partners for answering the questions in writing through the Q&A chat. That has been very helpful. There's one remaining question. I would invite the partners to have a look at them and see whether this final question can also still be addressed in writing, because we need to wrap up, unfortunately. I would like to invite my colleague to, yes, put up this final slide to thank you all for being with us today and to staying with us also throughout the 3 hours. We know that online this can be challenging sometimes, but we hope you found it interesting. You find more information on the respective project websites. We'll be sharing presentations as well as a recording of today's event as well, both on the project websites and on the POLIS website. And let me remind you of the next Mobilizing Mobility webinar organized by POLIS next Thursday, which is also looking at inclusive mobility solutions, and we'll be particularly looking at the co-design of such solutions, which Steve just highlighted in his presentation as being of very important value. More specifically, we'll be looking at the work of the Indemo, TRIPS and Dignity projects. So maybe we'll see you there. If not, I wish you a nice rest of the week, and thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all speakers as well for their interesting presentations and